really works is if I do my top shirt button up, and my voice will boom loudly to please everybody, but I will be asphyxiated within 3 minutes. So I've had to, I've had to undo my collar. But if there is a problem, please shout out, because it's not much fun if you can't hear what's going on. Okay, I think we're almost there. We've just got... Oh, yes, there, cell phones. I took mine off. I assumed you all did that, but if you didn't, that's what it looks like when it's off. Black. Good. Okay, I think we're all settled in. Shall we turn the lights out? And yesterday we went to Mexico. Today we're crossing the Pacific Ocean and continuing this theme of artistic and cultural cross currents, how one civilization and culture fertilizes another and vice versa. In other words, no man is an island entire unto himself, as I said yesterday. And today we're going to look at 3 artists who specialized in woodblock prints. You remember probably the same as I did at school. We had art classes, and no art classes have gone out of the window together with Greek and Latin now. But in the days when there were art classes in school, we learned how to do lino cuts, you remember, gouging out lino, covering what remained with ink, and doing a print. And the humble woodblock print really was elevated to a form of high art by 3 artists. Hokusai, who produced this great wave picture here, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Utamaro, and Hiroshi Gay. And these are the 3 principal artists who would inseminate Western art in the latter part of the 19th century, changing it irrevocably. The great wave here, let me just see how we work, there we go, is an iconic image I'm sure you're familiar with, as iconic as the Mona Lisa or Campbell's fruit can tin there of tomato soup. But in order to understand how this evolved in a society as sophisticated as Japan, an art form so simple, we need just to look at how Japan itself as a culture evolved. Its influence is seen here, for example, in Degas' picture here, painting here of ballet dancers on the stage in rehearsal, and he's used here a high viewpoint looking down on the stage, which was revolutionary at the time in 1870 or thereabouts when he painted this, again owing to the woodblock artists whose work we're going to see in detail shortly. And similarly, Toulouse Lautrec, who pioneered an entirely new art form, that of the illustrated poster. Prior to Lautrec, posters were just words, which were very difficult to read, and he dispensed with words almost entirely, using as a template the Japanese woodblock print, with the format being a print, flat patches of color, because you couldn't really elevate them and emboss them without a great deal of difficulty. And consequently, he produced a complete new art form, the illustrated poster. Just 2 very quick examples of how influential this movement was. So how did Japan evolve to this level of sophistication? And it all started several millennia ago, because then there was a land bridge between Mongolia and the upper islands of Japan. And that allowed Mongols to populate the islands of Japan as we know them today. And that was soon followed by a major migration of Chinese who had long coveted the mountainous archipelago of Japan lying 500 miles to the east. And from the Chinese perspective, Japan was the land of the rising sun, because that's where the Chinese saw the sun come up in the east. So they coveted this land and colonized it, mixing with the Mongol population, and that's why, genetically speaking, Japanese are different from Chinese because of that Mongolian influence that came down. When the Chinese arrived in Japan, they brought with them their writing system, their language, latterly Buddhism, and also their art. And this is a Chinese ink brush painting, as you can see, minimal effect, minimal touches on the paper with ink and water and washes, but creating this ethereal aspect of illusion, which greatly appealed to the more sophisticated members of society. But by the year 800, Japan had formed its own language, now separate from Chinese, with their own culture, and the various islands that make up the mountainous archipelago of Japan came together. The leaders of various fiefs came together and agreed that they would have one leader and unite their various territories in one country, Japan, appointing the first emperor. Art evolved as well, away from that mystical Japanese brush painting that we saw just now, to something a little more realistic, as you can see, a more realistic landscape depiction. And by 1100, there was a period of peace and prosperity from 800 to 1100, when the country began to get together and prosper. But then things began to break up with the appointment with fiefdoms vying again for dominance, the emperor being relegated to a sort of nominal figurehead, and the rise of the shogun. And the first shogun appeared in Japan in 1100, and from that time onwards, there was a continuous toing and froing of rival shoguns replacing others, a period of essentially civil war that lasted right up to 1600. Meanwhile, Japanese art had quietly evolved against this rather turbulent background. Now, as you can see, more vivid naturalization, the picture of this gnarled tree here, more vividly represented, and here a flying mythical creature. You can see the original, let me just go back one thing. This painting here would be done on long rolls of paper, and if you've been to a museum in Tokyo or seen an exhibition of Japanese art, you will see that it's on long scrolls in glass cabinets, and that's how the painting was presented early on. But with the evolution of Japanese art, it's now painted on the form of folding screens. You can see the vertical lines there of the various folds of the screen. So this was another evolution, as well as increasing realism in their art representation. By the year 1600, there was a major battle that took place between rival potential shoguns and the shogun who rose up above it all and maintained a dynasty that would last for 250 years, a period of unequaled economic and artistic prosperity in Japan. And that shogun was Ieyasu Tokugawa. And Tokugawa's dynasty, lasting for 250 years, saw this unprecedented growth. But because of the background of constant rivalries and shoguns being deposed by another and yet again, he took precautions, took two major dramatic steps to ensure his survival. The first thing he did was he appointed governors around the various islands of Japan, and he did so by retaining the families of these governors in his palace, in his capital, which was Edo. Edo is where Tokyo now is, whereas the emperor, who was still relegated as a figurehead, had his court in the ancient city of Kyoto, some 490 kilometers to the west. So the first thing he did was kept the families of the regional governors virtual hostages. They were treated very well, they were lavished, and they could enjoy Edo, but they had to remain within Edo to ensure the good behavior, and there would be no rivalry from the governors he had appointed. The second step he took was even more dramatic, and that was to almost entirely close Japan off from the rest of the world. And that seems a bizarre thing for somebody to do, but the reason was that he was concerned that if Japan was open up to trade by Europeans or Americans, the traders would strike local deals with local fiefs who would then be emboldened and potentially become a rival to the shogun. So for 250 years, Edo was the capital of a almost totally isolated Japan. He maintained his shogunate also by a system of informers throughout the country and spies, and a system also in creating an elite caste of samurai warriors who served two purposes. They were the shogun's private militia protecting him, and also they were the national police force patrolling the cities throughout the country, and they had a mandate to kill if anyone challenged their authority, and consequently they were widely feared throughout the country. When I say Japan was cut off, it was almost completely cut off, but not quite, because there had been some earlier concessions given to some traders. The Portuguese in particular had a small trading concession. But when the new shogun came in and was fearful of what that might imply for his survival, he limited that to the Dutch East India Company, which had been founded, as you know, around 1600, here the headquarters building in Amsterdam. The Dutch East India Company was granted a single concession in the southerly bay of Nagasaki, a long way from Kyoto and certainly a long way from Edo. And the ships of the Dutch East India Company were not really concerned with Japan at all. They were concerned with the spice trade in the East Indies, stopping in the Cape for reprovisioning, of course. And here is a map from 1620 or thereabouts, showing the East Indies, where the produce of the islands was highly sought after in the pre-refrigeration days of Europe. The spices were much in demand: cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, etc. And because the sailors of the Dutch East India Company were so intimately familiar with every nook and cranny of the islands of the East Indies where they took on their provisions, the maps that their cartographers drew were vastly out of scale, because in order to get every nook and cranny that was known recorded on paper, they had to enlarge everything. And here you see the West Indies, the East Indies here in landmass even bigger than India, which of course is not the case. Japan, interestingly, is just a few little dots right up there in the top right-hand corner. Can you see, sort of wandering up off the map almost there? Virtually terra incognita. The one exception was the concession that Tokugawa had made to the Dutch, and that was this little artificial island, very small, called Dejima, and this is Nagasaki Bay, right in the south of Japan. And it was an artificial island built specifically for the Dutch, who were held very much at arm's length, and they were linked to the mainland by a narrow policed causeway. So very restricted access. But this did allow a few Japanese exports to reach Europe, for example, textiles and ceramics, and a few importations, which included European books, which will be important as far as these artists are concerned, as we will see, but very limited. And this is Edo, 1600, when Tokugawa became the shogun and ruled, and his dynasty persisting for 250 years. And Edo started out really as a little village, and he chose that because it was deliberately far away from the south, where the traders might come, and also from Kyoto, where the emperor held court. And there we can see in the top right-hand quadrant there, we can see the wall around the shogun's palace, his garden where his vegetables and fruit were grown, and there were the housing for the shogun, his family, for the samurai warriors' families, and also for the families of all the colonial governors that were scattered around the country, regional governors, all the families were housed there. And within 100 years, Edo, now Tokyo, but Edo had grown from a population of around 1,000 to a population in 100 years of 1 million. Such was the economic growth and prosperity of this shogunate. And if you have an ever-expanding population, you need, of course, housing for them. So there were builders imported from all over, constructing homes, and then the citizens required entertainment. And the entertainment that prevailed at the time in Japan was the very austere no theatre. I don't know if any of you have been to a no theatre performance, but it's really it's startling because it's so different. It's very austere. There's no set other than just a tree in the background there. And the plot of the play is not a plot at all. It's a recited poem. And the actor stands here in a cage-like structure, gesticulating to emphasize the words of the poem. And there might be a little bit of drum beating in the background and a little plucking of stringed instruments to relieve the austerity of the performance. This was fine for the aristocrats, but it didn't sit well with the citizens who were actually supplying the shogun's court with everything they needed and building a flourishing economy. And the no theatre was then supplemented by what is known as kabuki theatre, which was the people's theatre. And unlike the no actors who performed in masks and were virtually motionless, These actors were very flamboyant with their costumes, their makeup, their gesticulations. The plots of the story were those with which the audience could readily identify because it reflected their day-to-day lives. And the emphasis of kabuki theater was on spectacle and comedy. And consequently, actors in the kabuki theater had a following. And rather like I'm not sure if it happens nowadays with Netflix and everything else you can get online, but in the days when Hollywood had the monopoly of entertainment, Hollywood actors would produce, their publicity people would produce photographs which would then be avidly collected by the fans of the actors. And so it was with the kabuki actors. And here where we have artists whose job it was to carve woodcuts in order to illustrate books. They were essentially the technicians of book illustration at the time, now switching from book illustration to producing woodcut prints of actors in their costume. And here you can see a couple of kabuki actors, and this is a print that would have been distributed and sold. And the beauty of print, of course, is that you have your woodblock and you can run off 20, 100, even a couple of hundred prints, and consequently the cost was low and affordable to the population in general. And the kabuki actors would not be wearing masks, they would be wearing makeup, and their gesticulations and their gestures of their face would be very much in keeping with the comedy that they were depicting on the stage. There would be stylized gestures. For example, they would have you staring eyes. The whites of the eyes would be apparent to the audience. They would roll their heads to emphasize the dialogue, and then they would freeze with their chin over one shoulder to emphasize the point they were trying to make. This was a stylized form of production which the audience absolutely lapped up. And so here there was a ready market. The kabuki theaters in the No theaters were now becoming the red light district of Edo. And there were baths, as you can see here. There were sumo wrestling rings. There were tea houses. In this woodcut of a bath scene here, we can see a mother on the right there at the bottom, drying down her baby with her towel. And as a little bit of whimsy, if you look right at the top left-hand corner, there's a little square, and you can see a face of a peeping Tom looking through the window. And there were geishas. Geishas were ladies who were trained in the art of poetry, music, and conversation. And they were hired out to wealthy individuals as escorts for the evening. But unlike courtesans, the geishas, we got somebody there who's ringing for a geisha. Let me see. I'm afraid they're all booked. You have to book a long time ahead. Geishas, unlike courtesans, for geishas, sexual favors were neither expected nor given. So a fundamental distinction between the two. And so the artists, now we're getting to see the actual work of these woodblock artists. And here is Utamaro, who specialized in the depiction of beautiful women, because now there was a market for the print, not only for kabuki actors, but for beautiful women as well. And he was a specialist in the depiction of beautiful women, and there was a stylization in the same way there was to No acting and kabuki acting, to the portrayal of beautiful women in Japanese aesthetic. And they all looked a bit bland. They had big, featureless faces, devoid of any sort of emotion or interaction. They were just there as sort of iconic things to look at. And he introduced two innovations. The first was to fill the whole page, the whole sheet of the print with the head itself, so it had a dramatic impact. But more importantly, he made these people living individuals. Here, for example, is a courtesan. We know she's a courtesan because of her elaborate hairdo with all the sticks in there. And there she is, resting her head on her hand there, looking down at a scroll of paper, and in her other hand, a pen. And she's thinking, what is she going to write? And we're left to imagine, perhaps it's one of her clients who's got a bit sweet on her and wants to make a date, and she's not quite sure how to respond. Pure speculation, but this is how he was thinking, to make these lively people, not just icons, if you like. And here's another one now. And she is interesting because she has shaved eyebrows. And the convention was, if you painted a beautiful woman with shaved eyebrows, it meant she was newly married. And here she is, resting her head on her hand again, her eyes almost closed, and I wonder what she's thinking. What have I got myself into in this marriage? And here's another woman here in her mirror, painting, putting on her makeup. So these are real, live, living people then that Utamaro was doing, and here another one having her hair combed out. And as far as the aesthetics and the construction of the actual artwork is concerned, the thread running through this, bearing in mind these are woodblock prints, is the flatness of the colour and the plainness of the background and the liberal use of black for emphasis. And I think we've seen that in all those examples. And it's these aspects of Japanese art that are going to be carried through particularly into Western art, as we will see shortly. Erotica was always much in demand, but by 1700, Edo was getting the reputation for being decadent, and the shogun imposed strict censorship. So this sort of thing was no longer permissible, and this was a work by Utamaro, who had done these beautiful ladies, and he got into trouble, not for this particular picture, but for illustrating a novel with semi-erotic pictures which offended the censor. And he was punished for that with 3 days in prison, and for 50 days he had his hands in chains so he could not work. So there was a clampdown on the decadence of this blue light district, if you like. This whole world that was being depicted goes by the Japanese name of Ikuo-e, which is a bit of a mouthful because the vowels are difficult for us to pronounce, but that would translate as the floating world of delights, the red light district of Edo and all the things that went on there, the baths, the courtesans, etc. And now we come to the second of these artists, and this is Katsushika Hokusai, the painter of the Great Wave. And he carried woodblock printing into the realm of high art, and because of the books that were arriving, albeit in dribs and drabs, in the Dejima Island in Nagasaki Bay, he had access to what was going on in the West. And as we'll see in a moment, he was highly innovative, enormously productive, lived to his 80s, and we'll see just how he elevated this art form into something completely different. Here he is himself, born in 1760 in Edo, and he trained not as an artist, but as the actual carver of the woodblock. The artist did the drawing, and then the woodblock carver carved it out, and that was handed on to a printer, who then printed a number of copies that were demanded, and the prints were then sold by the publisher. So it was a four-step business getting these pictures to market. And he started out as the actual carver, not the original work. The artist gave him the work, and there he scooped it all out and produced the woodblock. But having done that for a while, he thought he would like to be an artist himself. So he apprenticed himself to an artist, a woodblock artist, not a carver, but an artist who specialized in kabuki actors in realistic settings, unlike the austere No. And this is by his teacher. But realizing this was a very crowded field of kabuki prints, he decided that he would do something completely different, and that is, knowing the history of Japanese art, almost entirely depicting Japanese landscape, he would introduce landscape to the woodblock print for the first time. And he did so cautiously, here with a very fine line drawing, and here we see something very interesting. In the distance we see Mount Fuji, we'll talk about shortly. But there we see a group of travelers. It looks like a father with a load that he's just put down on the sand there, the mother talking to the child and perhaps a sister. And they've taken, it looks as though they've taken a shortcut across the beach with their load, and they've just taken everything off their backs for the moment, put everything down to rest, being unaware that there is a big wave building up, can you see on the left-hand side there, about to swamp them. And this is the first iteration of Hokusai's great wave painting. And he did many of these, as you probably know, but this was the first example where he was just testing the water, literally, as it were, to do this iconic image. He was also a poet. He was enormously productive, enormously industrious, and enormously gifted in so many areas, Hokusai. He was a poet in his own right, having written over 200 poems. But he illustrated his own poems and the poems of other people. Here's a poem by another poet, and the story is depicted in Hokusai's illustration of a boat here, a ferry boat, overloaded, about to cross the river, which is very choppy, so you can imagine what the poem was all about. He also had a wonderful gift for composition. And just look at this gnarled cherry tree here, probably with some lichen growing over the branches there to give it that mottled appearance. And he's placed this diagonally across the field, overlapping with the circle here. And this, of course, is a waning moon. So it's a push and pull picture. Not only is it beautifully composed, it's a push and pull picture insofar as the buds are bursting open into blossom while the moon is fading. So I thought that's rather a lovely thing to show you. And then, of course, there was erotica. He had to be careful about erotica now. He didn't want his hands in chains either. So he paints this, which he just simply calls the dream of the fisherman's wife. Well, from your reaction, I needn't say more, and we'll move on. And he introduced still life, again, a new concept for Japanese art, because he'd learnt about that from the West. Still life was something now that he could introduce. And again, what a wonderful eye for composition. Everything is where it should be, the cups, the bowls, the crinkled up paper there, and the chopsticks lying diagonally across. And here he's illustrated a book of ghost stories. Tim Burton, you know Tim Burton, who illustrates those gothic movies with animation and strange, weird things. I bet you anything you like, he knew of this picture by Hokusai because there's almost an identical image in one of his animated movies of gothic horror. And here's Hokusai. It's a lantern, but it illustrates a ghost story that accompanies the illustration. And then he's hugely productive, very wealthy, because of the success of all this newly introduced Western concept into Japanese art. He's now 70 years old when he embarks on his masterpiece. And his masterpiece was to introduce yet another new concept into Japanese art, and that is of the serial picture. And the serial pictures, of course, are the 36 images of views of Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji holds a special place in Japanese culture and religion, 12,000 feet tall, and on a clear day it can be seen from Edo or from Tokyo, and it is held it's endowed with a certain mystique, which I think you can understand why. And here is one of the views just captured in the orange light of an early dawn. But now Hokusai has discovered something else in Western art, and that is the concept of chiaroscuro, the contraplacing of brightness and darkness to emphasize a dramatic effect. And here he's used that concept here in this hill covered in trees you can see in the front. Behind it's now looming dark compared to the brightness of the light reflecting off the water behind. And it's part of the 36 views of Mount Fuji, and there, obligatory, is Mount Fuji in the background. But introducing another Western concept. And now yet another Western concept he's discovered is linear perspective. Linear perspective is where two sides are receding away, parallel lines. If they recede away from you, they seem to converge. And if you look at the banks of the river here, left and right, and just project the line that they're taking, they meet under the middle arch there of the bridge, way in the distance against the horizon in that little tower. Can you see there? And so he's introduced this for the first time into Japanese art from Western art. And there, of course, just tucked away in the corner there, almost an afterthought, Mount Fuji. And now yet again something different. Here he's done Mount Fuji, but he's also placed this enormous tree in front of it, so big that these three travelers have put their bundles down and are stretching their arms around the tree there just to emphasize how broad it is. And this is a device that the Western artists are going to use as well, as we're going to see. Because by definition, cross currents travel in two directions. And here is the great wave. And I think we need to appreciate something. It's like anything you become familiar with, you really miss the point eventually because you say, oh yes, that's Hokusai's great wave, move on, what's the next thing of interest? Not so. It is very interesting and much more profound than we give it credit for on first acquaintance. And if all we have to do to appreciate that is to actually read the title that Hokusai gave to the great wave. He called it, "In the Hollow of a Great Wave off the Coast of Kanagawa." So it's the hollow of the great wave. And there in the hollow of the great wave in the distance, what do we see? Mount Fuji, part of that same series. As Westerners, we're conditioning to read, because we read from left to right, as Westerners, we tend to read pictures from left to right as well. And if you do that, it's quite quite impressive, I think you would agree. But the Japanese read their pictures from right to left. Imagine yourself now on the right-hand side of this picture, and there is the great wave just about to swamp you. And just to emphasize the point, he's put a couple of boats in there about to be swamped by the boat. So I think you would agree that as you get into his mindset, you can see there's much more to the great wave than perhaps we had acknowledged through our over-familiarity with this iconic work. He revisits it later on in some sketchbooks, and here you can see the great wave breaking off. And as the foam breaks off the crest of the wave there, it morphs into a flock of birds. Such is the inventiveness of this man. Like Leonardo da Vinci, he was a great observer of nature, and he produced 12 large notebooks of sketches, just like Leonardo had done. And here he's depicted fish. On the left side, numerous sea creatures, all in great anatomical detail, and on the right, he made it look as though they're all swimming around in an aquarium. And people too. Here on the left-hand page, we've got a pole going up there. Can you see a man's climbed up the pole and looks as though he's trying to shin down, only to find the person below him has actually lost his grip and about to crash down. Right at the bottom of the left-hand page, there's a man trying to hold on for dear life to a bolting horse. And there on the left-hand page in the top right-hand corner, a man thumbing his nose from inside a glass bottle. Impish humour. On the right-hand page, we have an aquatic scene of humans. Here, 3 of them treading water with their lifeboats, or one holding onto a bolster there, while down below 2 are fishing, one for fish and the other for seaweed. And this collection of books is known as Hokusai's manga. Manga is a term still used in Japan to refer to the comic books that are so popular, which actually we've all seen on television now as cartoon films. Japanese cartoon films are derived from Japanese manga drawings because they're published as comic book flat images on paper. These were known as Hokusai's mangas. This is the original use of the word manga to describe his compositions as sketches. And he did them as a source of reference to himself in his work, but also, being big-hearted man that he was, he made these freely available to any young artist who wanted inspiration. And then the third great artist that we have to consider is Hiroshi Gay. And Hiroshige was a different kettle of fish altogether. He was from a samurai family. His father was the instructor of archery at the shogun's palace in Edo, and he himself was employed as a fire watchman in the shogun's court. And there, to show his distinguished caste from the samurai, he has crests on his gown there that are the family crests awarded to him and his family by the shogun. And he was a very kindly man, as you can see from his face, I think, here. And he was renowned not only for his vivid imagination and creativity, as we're going to see at the moment, because he took these artists yet a further leap forward, which would inseminate Western art in no uncertain terms. And he was the prime inseminator of Western art, if you like. But he was a kindly man, and he was renowned for undercharging his clients, and he never became rich. Just like Hokusai, starting off with nice simple line drawings, as you can see here, which were subsequently colored. And now he goes a bit further than Hokusai. Hokusai goes further than we saw with the Great Wave, where a linear perspective, you remember the river with the linear perspective meeting just to the side of Mount Fuji. He now introduces, Hiroshige now introduces the concept not of linear perspective, but of atmospheric perspective. And this is something that really came in the Renaissance with Leonardo da Vinci. If you think of any of Leonardo da Vinci's, I'm thinking of the Virgin of the Rocks, for example, in the National Gallery in London, a vivid blue Virgin there with the child, and in the background you see misty mountains. And that was the beginning of this type of perspective, visual perspective. And the essence of that is the nearer things are, the sharper and brighter, the further away they are, the more blurred they are through the mist. And here you see Hokusai Hiroshige for the first time introducing into Japanese art this concept of atmospheric perspective. He was fascinated by changes of the weather and mood. Here, an island in the rain, the same misty effects the rain has. And here he's painting, he's done a drawing here of the Ryogoku district of Edo, just around the corner of the bay, and there is the shoreline, but instead of just drawing the shoreline for the carver to produce for the print, he makes us look through the lattice of the bridge, in the same way that Hokusai had done with that tree, remember, in front of Mount Fuji. So now Hiroshige takes it a step further by giving us a complicated lattice to look around. And this will be very influential in Western art, as we'll see in a moment. And then he was very taken by Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji and wants to do his own series, and he does so now with a series of woodblock illustrations to be carved and printed, 53 stages on the Tokaido Road is the title of the series. And you say, well, what's the Tokaido Road? Tokaido Road was a road widened by the shogun that went from Edo in the east to Kyoto in the west, where the emperor held his ceremonial court. And once a year, the shogun would go with his entourage along the Tokaido Road to pay his respects to the emperor. And this was a yearly pilgrimage. And Hiroshige decides to follow that procession and actually join it, taking with him scores of blank notebooks, which he made thousands of drawings, sketches on the way, which he then worked up to the drawings that the wood carvers produced in the prints that we're going to see. And here's one of them, one of the stages on the Tokaido Road, a little village where they stopped for the night, and there a family walking along that just caught his eye. The father there with this strange thing on the back, apparently it's a gift for the local temple, but it looks a little bit more comical than that. And now Hiroshige adopts something new to Western art that we saw in that picture at the beginning there of Edgar Degas looking down on the ballet dancers rehearsing. And I said that this was something new in Western art. It was also something new in Japanese art. And here's the origin of that perspective that Degas adopted so frequently. And here we're looking down on a group of travelers, and again the effects of weather, and you can see the pine trees in the distance becoming almost invisible through the shards of rain coming down. And then another stop on the road of the Tokaido was at night, and suddenly the full moon bursts out, illuminating brightly a snow-covered winter scene, the village where they were going to stop for the night. And here he now captures this scene here with a rising moon in the early evening, you can just see, and the moonlight has produced this fluorescent blue here. And here we can almost feel the effort of the punter there, trying to punt his punt heavily laden, not only against the stream, but against the wind. And now he changes. He now does 100 views around Edo. And he chose here to create this image to be carved of the Ataki Bridge running across the bay of Edo. And here again, he loves the rain, and here pedestrians caught in the squall there, running for all their life. But he's now adopted a vertical format deliberately because he wants to cut off abruptly the picture from the left and on the right in order for us to question what lies beyond the frame on those sides. We're a bit curious that it's a bit stilted. And also he's adopted this high viewpoint, so much so that the bank on the other side almost seems to be sloping down. So highly innovative in that respect as well. And now taking Hokusai's tree in front of Mount Fuji to the next level, Hiroshige now takes this bough of a plum tree way across our field there with its branches going up, another one down below, making it very difficult for us to see beyond that the rest of the plum orchard you can see there. And this particular picture is going to fascinate the Paris artists of the late 19th century who were so important and who are all household names to us today. And then he does this picture here of the flying carp on the sticks, on the poles here, and the view of Mount Fuji in the distance there. So highly innovative, as you can see, in the way he approaches things. Hokusai Hiroshige died in about 1850 or thereabouts, and the whole art of Japanese woodcut painting really began to fall away in abeyance and almost disappeared from art in Japan. But it was now taken over in Europe. And to understand how it got from Japan to Europe, bearing in mind that the shogun had closed Japan off entirely to the rest for 250 years. How could all these innovations by these artists find their expression in Western art? And that all came about largely to this result of this one man. And this is Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy, acting on behalf of President Fillmore. It was 1853. And the American president was worried that the Europeans were eventually going to crack the code and get into Japan, and he wanted to be sure that America had part of the action, not only part of the action, but had the action before the Europeans, recognizing there was potential for trade there. They were already trading with China, so it wasn't too far to go to Japan. Perry brings a flotilla with him, and he enters Nagasaki Bay, where we had that Dutch concession, you remember, on that artificial island, and he sends a little boat ashore with a message addressed not to the emperor in Kyoto, but to the shogun in Edo, because that's where the power lies. And it was a request to have a meeting with the shogun with a view to discussing a treaty to open Japan up to American trade. And he waited and waited and waited, and there was no response. So his fleet then set sail for Edo Bay. And here they are. This is the print I could find of Edo Bay. The Commodore's ship, in fact, the flagship of the fleet of warships here, was actually a steam frigate, armed steam frigate, for steam was now coming in for the first time. And another consideration for opening up Japan to America was not only trade, but for coal in order to supply their steamships, because their navy was now being switched from sail to steam. So coaling stations were as much a priority as trading stations. Frustrated at not getting a response from the shogun, he arrives now in Edo Bay, and there up on the hill is the shogun's castle. He lines all his gunships up, broadside on to the castle, and then upon the signal, they all open fire. 72 shells are fired in the direction of Edo Castle, where the shogun is watching this. The shells were all blanks, but the shogun got the message. He sent a messenger down to intercede with this, to find out what was going on. And he was told, oh, Commodore messaged the shogun, I pay my respects. Please don't be alarmed. The date I noticed today is the 6th of July, 1853. This is just a belated celebration of America's July the 4th birthday. That was the origin of the expression gunboat diplomacy. It was very effective. It took a year to form a treaty, and gifts were exchanged. The Americans gave the Japanese their first steam locomotive, set up a system of communications throughout the country, which was new, chests and chests of small arms, and even more chests of whiskey. The full text of the treaty was in Japanese and English, and the basic provision was that there would be 2 deep water ports available to American ships for free trade, free offloading of American produce, the free exportation of Japanese goods to America, and there would be an exchange of diplomatic representatives. And there other provisions as well were built in. And soon after this, France, Britain, Portugal, Germany all had their own treaties now with Japan, and Japan was now open to the West. Art in the West was at a crossroads. There'd been a period of classicism that had gone on. Impressionism was just beginning in the 1860s or thereabouts. And the gap was filled by the movement known as Romanticism, a yearning for something different from the somewhat sterile, stereotyped classical paintings that European art had fallen into at the beginning of the 19th century. And here's Eugène Delacroix's depiction here of the fanatics at Tangiers is the way he called it. It's not a terribly memorable name, but you see it emphasizes how there's a yearning for the exotic. Already trade was coming in from China, so they were used to things Chinese, but now the scene was set to welcome anything that was now coming in from Japan. And the first thing that came from Japan were not artworks, but copies of the books of Hokusai, his manga drawings. And these were brought into Paris, whereupon the designers for the Paris porcelain factories seized upon them and used Hokusai's images here in order to decorate a dinner service, as you can see. And these were then copied in England and became very fashionable in the mid-1850s. Department stores in the latter part of the 19th century were now opening up in Paris and in London as well. And the new concept of a department store was there wasn't a counter with a person behind and all the goods are on the shelf and you say, I want a yard of that material back there behind your left shoulder. They would all be on display where people could mingle around and see. And the owners of the department stores were absolutely thrilled to display the wealth of goods that were now coming in from Japan, which include kimonos, textiles, pottery, ceramics, fans, and lacquerware. Lacquerware was particularly prized, and immediately local producers seized upon these examples for local production. And here is a completely over-the-top inkstand in lacquerware, with every millimetre covered with an abundance of Japanese design motifs. Such was the thirst for anything exotic that prevailed at the time. Magazines appeared here, Le Japon Artistique, to introduce the Japanese aesthetic to a Western audience in the form of an art magazine. And then, at the end of the century, Giacomo Puccini got on the bandwagon as well with Madama Butterfly. The story, of course, is of a geisha who falls for Lieutenant Pinkerton, who arrives in one of the ships that are now coming in to take Japanese goods back to America. She falls in love with him, gives birth to his love child, and she waits for 2 years for him to return. And there, at last, she sees the ship coming with Lieutenant Pinkerton aboard, she hopes, to take her away together with her and her child to America. I won't tell you how the story ends, but let me caution you, if you do see the opera, don't forget a large box of Kleenex. How did the artists, here we have Edouard Manet, painting here of his friend Émile Zola. How did Manet deal with this influx of Japanese prints? Because now all the bouquinistes on the side of the Seine were full of Japanese prints coming in from Hokusai and Hiroshi Gay and Utamaro, and they were all being lapped up because they were so exotic and so different and so interesting and so financially accessible. How did the artists respond to these? And here's Manet's first tentative attempt at responding to these, and he pins up a lot of Japanese prints as a background to that, and he gives Zola a black jacket, again reminiscent of the Japanese emphasis on black on their prints. And now he goes full hog. He recognizes the Japanese print aesthetic of a plain background, bold flat patches of color, because that's the nature of woodblock printing. And here he uses a generous amount of black. And this, of course, is his iconic picture of the young boy Piper that we've all recognized. But now we've seen a bit of the Japanese precedent. I think we can see exactly where this came from. And what about James Tissot, a popular portrait painter in Paris at the time? He very cautiously dips his toe in the Japanese aesthetic by draping his somewhat overweight model here with a Japanese kimono. But here we have Monet, Claude Monet, and his wife here, who he dresses not only in a kimono, but festoons the whole picture here with Japanese fans, but furthermore is a bit more subtle, because if you recall some of the early pictures of the beauties, particularly Utamaro very early on, they were all tall, languid beauties in the full picture before we just saw the head occupying the whole page. And here she adopts the Japanese pose with the pan. So he was very much enamored of Japan, intensely working on his impressionism, and he wouldn't deviate from that at all, but nonetheless he did do this as an acknowledgement, and of course his Japanese water lily pond and the Japanese bridge that went over it, and he built up a large collection of these prints, which didn't really influence his painting because he was so intent on the effects of light on objects. But he did recognize the potential for placing an object in front of a scene. Take the tree away, and how boring would that view be? And now he's using Hokusai's pine tree in front of Mount Fuji, and much the same that Hiroshi Gay did with the plum tree going diagonally across the field. He's tentatively trying it out, but he abandons it because that's not really what he does. But he did at least acknowledge that that's something new. And then there's Vincent van Gogh. And here is Van Gogh's dealer, not painting dealer, because that was his brother Theo, of course. This was his artist supplies dealer. This is Père Tanguy. He was affectionately known as Père Tanguy, as Daddy Tanguy, because he didn't charge the artists if they couldn't afford it. He just ran up ticks, and they all had to, almost everything that they bought was on credit. And here he paints him, Japanese style, flat on, and because Van Gogh bought a large collection from Tanguy of prints, here he paints him in a background of all the prints hanging up in his shop. He was so... Van Gogh was obsessional to the nth degree, and here he has a copy of Hiroshige's picture here of the Otake Bridge in the rain and the steeply disappearing background there, and he makes a meticulous copy. This is Van Gogh's copy of that picture of Hiroshige, and he's festooned the frame with a lot of Japanese characters, and I'm sorry to say I'm not able to say what they mean. And here again, he's made a meticulous copy of Hiroshige's famous plum tree picture here, trying to see the orchard beyond again with the frame suitably drawn. And he wasn't the only one who was taken by this. And here we have James Mcneill Whistler, the American painter who spent much of his career in London, who had a wonderful knack for capturing the watery grey light of a London winter's day, which I think you can acknowledge. And here we're looking at the Thames. The Thames is curving away from us in the distance there. On the left, the south bank, and on the right, the north bank, curving away. But in order to see it, we have this big bridge there with its lattice work blocking the view intentionally, because he was very much taken by the Royo Yoko district bridge painted here by Hiroshige. And he wasn't the only one who was fascinated by this bridge concept of looking at something through a lattice work. And this is Caillebotte, Gustave Caillebotte, painting. The subject of this painting is not the man with the top hat or the bridge, but is the smoke coming out of the steam locomotive. Can you see in the top right hand there, as the steam locomotive is now crossing the viaduct? But again, in order to see that, we have to look through this lattice work, the concept of which was pioneered by Hiroshige. And now again, the same way that Hiroshige did that vertical format, cutting off the left and cutting off the right, so that our eye would instinctively want to know what's going on the sides. Here, Caillebotte again does this rainy Parisian scene with a man just entering the field from the right side there, again, very much in the style of Hiroshige. But if you ask me which is the one artist I think who has absorbed most from this invasion of Japanese art, that would be Edgar Degas. And here Edgar Degas looks not down on the scene of the ballet dancers rehearsing that we saw at the beginning here, but now he's looking up in a sort of vertiginous way up at Lala. Lala is a circus performer. She's at the Fernando Circus in Paris, and she's about to do her, with her teeth gripping onto a spinet, and she's about to spin around. And Degas places her at the side and way at the top there, again in the manner of Hiroshige, looking at an unusual angle. And now, what about entering and leaving the field? And here we have a gentleman in a grey frock coat, top hat, beard and cigar, taking his daughters with their dog to their riding lesson, crossing the Place de la Concorde. And he's about to stride out of the picture. Who else would paint a man and his daughters striding out of the picture? You would want them in the middle of the picture, you would think. No. Degas was very much influenced by Hiroshige's construction, and here the man is about to leave the picture. At the same time, another man is turning round and about to enter it from the right-hand side. You can see how influential these artists were. And now again we have a ballet scene of Degas, and here the ballet master resting his hands on his stick there as he puts his young pupils through their paces in rehearsal. And of course the scene of the action is the ballet master. He's the center of the action, there are the dancers. But no, for Degas, the center of the action is in fact the girl scratching her back on the piano on the left there, and her companion there with her big green bow. So again, this off-center way of looking at things, thanks to the Japanese aesthetic. And in the same way we had to look over that bough of the plum tree to see the orchard beyond, we now have to look over the heads of Degas' musicians in the pit of a ballet performance, the ballerina there just taking her bow to the audience. If we want to see the trees beyond, we have to look over their heads, and again in the Japanese aesthetic, the dense use of black. And then Mary Cassatt, American painter who spent a lot of time in Paris, who made her reputation really with mother and baby pictures and children's pictures. This was her niche, and she had a fine collection of Japanese prints. And here you can see, this is a Japanese print, and there's in her collection of a mother lifting her baby out from the bathwater. And now she does an elegant aquatint etching of a similar scene now, very much the same aesthetic, plain background, bold, flat use of color here. And here is a mother not taking her baby out of the bath, but testing the water temperature with her hand before placing her baby in the bath.